Are you looking for an easy way to fail your check ride? Well, look no further because in this video, we're going to talk about 5 easy steps that'll get you to fail your check ride.
Yeah.
Welcome to Free Pilot Training. I'm Josh, and this is my friend Seth Lake. He's a designated pilot examiner, or DPE, and he's going to give you 5 easy ways to fail your check ride. Thanks for joining me today, Seth. This is going to be an interesting video.
Yeah. Usually I'm focused on how to make sure you pass your check ride. And we're saying this in kind of jest. Yeah, there's a lot of ways that you can fail your check ride, but these are really kind of some of the most common reasons I see failures day to day.
Yeah, and I think if you kind of know what to look for, then maybe you can just keep that from happening.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
so the first one you told me was don't be eligible for the check ride. Now, what in the world does that mean?
Yeah, eligibility is a big deal because as the examiner, I'm kind of the last line of defense
Yeah,
to make sure when you show up as an applicant for your test that you're actually qualified.
yeah,
Now you do plug in some hours and stuff into IACRA, but IACRA doesn't catch everything. So I need to make sure that all the endorsements are there, that all the time that's logged was logged appropriately. So stuff like that I've seen are cross-country flights that didn't actually meet the criteria for a cross-country flight. For instance, a landing didn't occur or it wasn't over that threshold of the
yeah,
50 nautical
yeah.
miles. And so that is cross country time that doesn't count. Now, if you don't have any extra cross country time to make up for that, then that could be the difference between you being qualified for the test and
Yeah,
not qualified for
yeah.
the test.
What about solo time? Is that a pretty common one too?
Yeah, miss log solo time. I wouldn't say that's real common. Now, something that I saw recently is unendorsed solo time. So there is a 90-day endorsement that you have to get every 90 days from your instructor. And with there being an examiner shortage and all, people were waiting a long time for their test.
Yeah,
And so they wind up needing more than one of those 90-day endorsements, and their instructor may forget about that. So then you show up the day of the check ride and you don't have a 90-day endorsement, especially if you flew the airplane there.
yeah,
That was unlogged solo time. If
yeah.
you were relying on that to qualify for the test, it doesn't count.
So let me ask you this. If I, as an instructor, send a student up for the check ride, is that my fault as an instructor? Is that the student's fault? Or both of us?
Yeah, y'all both share some liability there, but
Yeah,
really, especially for a private pilot, I'm gonna look at the instructor and give you a side eye, be like, "Hey, man, why aren't you preparing your student?" Because as a student, you don't know what you don't know. All
yeah,
right, you're a little bit ignorant to the ways of endorsement requirements
yeah,
and all that. That you're really heavily relying on your instructor.
yeah,
So that's why it's really important for your instructor, if you can, have your instructor be there at least until we get the
yeah,
application signed. Because what often happens is that 90-day endorsement's missing.
yeah,
The instructor's in the lobby. I can call the instructor in here. I can give him a slap on the wrist and be like, "Hey, did you actually mean to endorse it? Just forget." And 9
yeah.
times out of 10, they'll say, "Yeah, I just forgot to give that endorsement." I'm like, "Okay, let's make sure that endorsement is there in the logbook, logged appropriately, and we can move on." If they're not there, then that's a showstopper, and we can't even start the test.
Yeah, and I think, well, for me, my very first student I sent up to you actually, he didn't have 1 hour of cross-country solo time that he needed, and because I just miscalculated, and I was looking over his logbook, and I said, "We're gonna have to fly a cross-country solo," so he had to fly a cross-country solo, 1 hour there and 1 hour back. Well, he could have done 30 minutes, but he wanted to do an hour, so and then I guess that probably made him more tired for the check ride the next day, but
Man, we'll
because
talk
we were
about that
stressed.
later.
All right, so another easy step to fail your check ride is to not have personal minimums. Is something common?
So it's that this is kind of a complicated question, but first of all, personal minimums is specifically listed in Area of Operation 1, which if you're familiar with the Airman Certification Standards, or if you're not familiar with the Airman Certification Standards, that would be reason number 6 to fail your check twice. So make sure you're familiar with the ACS before you go take your test.
Yeah.
And I've got a ton of content on the ACS, of course, but in Area of Operation 1, that's primarily where most of the oral exams come in.
Yeah.
And in there, in a couple different places in your risk management section, it talks about developing personal minimums. So you need to have personal minimums developed going into the check ride. And more importantly, you need to abide by those personal
Yeah.
minimums. And so what I've seen and had to issue disapprovals for in the past is an applicant will come to me with personal minimums that, they spent a few minutes developing with their CFI and then kind of forgot about it. So they're really just checking the box.
Yeah.
And we get out to fly that day and the weather is beyond those personal minimums. If they choose to fly, basically, if they start the engine, release the
Yeah.
parking brake, I've got to issue a disapproval right there because you just violated your personal
Yeah.
minimums. So not only develop your personal minimums, but plan to follow those personal minimums. And the correct answer is, hey, Mr. DPE or Mrs. DPE, I can't continue the check ride because the weather's beyond my personal minimums. I'm going to have a discontinuance. And your DPE is going to say, great decision. That's the right decision.
What would you say to somebody that said, "Well, the FAR is my personal minimums"?
Yeah, you could do that. If you say I've chosen not to develop personal minimums, I'm just going to use the FARs.
Yeah.
So what I'm probably going to do as an examiner, most examiners will probably do, is they'll start giving you a scenario that
Yeah.
should hopefully maybe make you a little uncomfortable and think about, well, maybe I do need personal minimums. Because remember, if you're in Class G airspace, 1 mile clear clouds.
Yeah.
So that may be what I ask is what's the lowest visibility or weather you've ever flown in?
Yeah.
And a new private pilot is probably going to say something like, 6 miles, maybe
Yeah.
4 miles, maybe. But often, if you've learned to fly in Phoenix, you probably rarely, if ever, flown with
Yeah.
less than 10 miles visibility. So legally, you could take off 1 mile clear of clouds. 1 mile
Yeah.
visibility is extremely low. If you're at a 7,000-foot runway, you can't see the end of the runway.
Yeah.
That's,
And another thing, personal minimums can be based on location because I've done some flying up in Alaska where my personal minimums had to be right on the edge of the FARs because if I didn't, then we weren't going to be able to accomplish what we needed to accomplish. And then you have to break out risk management and decide like, well, is this worth it then?
yeah, and that's exactly right. And if the conversation goes well, hopefully that's where it goes
Yeah.
is, okay, if you are indeed going to use the FARs as your minimum, so the legal mins are your personal minimum, then what other risk management devices are you going to have in place to make sure you stay safe?
Yeah.
And that may mean, okay, I'm really going to make sure that I'm well rested beforehand. I'm always going to fly with my EFB. I'm always going to have some sort of onboard weather
Yeah.
capability, uh, preferably some sort of way to check for terrain avoidance, all that stuff. So there is a way to do that safely,
Yep.
but we're going to have a longer conversation about that. The easy answer is if you're a private pilot, you need to have personal
Yep.
notes.
All right. So step number 5 on how to fail your check ride is don't know how to use your EFB.
Yeah, this is, man, I'm surprised and not surprised all at once.
So what is an EFB before we continue? Because I think we have a lot of new pilots on here.
Sure, the EFB is kind of the legalese term for an iPad, essentially,
Yeah.
and electronic flight bag is what EFB stands for. And we call it an EFB because it's device independent,
Yeah.
right? Because you could be using a laptop or an Android tablet with an application loader on it. So it doesn't have to be an iPad.
Yeah.
But let's be honest here, most pilots are using an iPad with ForeFlight.
With ForeFlight. Yeah.
Yeah, and ForeFlight is what we would call an EFB program.
Yeah.
And so an iPad by itself isn't necessarily an EFB, but an iPad with ForeFlight installed now becomes
It's flight
an
planning
electronic flight bag.
software.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ForeFlight gives us access to basically everything that we need in terms of planning and documents that the FAA publishes. So it has all of our charts, it has all of our FAA documents and regulations, it has our flight planning software is all integrated into that ForeFlight.
And so what's an example of when a student came to you for the check ride and did not know how to use their EFB?
This can take place several different ways. So the first way is, and this is probably the most common, is the performance profile. So a lot of students, especially with the new ACS that came out last year, it explicitly says that a electronically derived flight plan is acceptable.
Yeah.
Now that's always been the case, but they've actually formalized that in the ACS. So people have taken this big sigh of relief of like, I don't need a paper plan anymore. And so they show up with the EFB and ask to see their cross country flight plan, and they hand me the iPad, and it has 2 points: their departure and their destination. Well, right there is kind of unsat because later on in the check ride, you have to use a flight log to do pilotage and
Yeah.
dead reckoning. So if you have point A to B and no checkpoints in between, there's no way that you can meet the requirement of pilotage and dead reckoning.
Yeah.
So that's number one of not knowing how to use it. Number two is, let's say they do have the points in there. The performance profile in ForeFlight, we have two options. You could build a custom performance
Mm.
profile, or if you have a higher level of subscription, you can use a ForeFlight kind of curated performance profile
Yeah.
for your make and model. So that opens yourself up to a couple ways you can mess it up. Either when you're creating your custom profile, you fat finger in a number or you get a number wrong because you didn't get it from the manual. And those numbers would be like a cruise airspeed or a fuel burn.
Yeah.
Those are the two most important. So if you get your cruise airspeed wrong by 5 knots and your fuel burn off by 2 or 3 gallons, now your flight planning is kind of out to lunch. And the unfortunate thing is, for flight will make it look very official.
Yeah.
It makes everything look great. And because you put bad data in, it put perfect bad data back
Yeah.
out
And
to
it
you.
looks so good.
And it looks so good. You're like, oh yeah, this flight, I'm only going to use 16 gallons. So yeah, I'm, load up to 23 gallons as
Yeah.
my min takeoff fuel with reserves. And I'm looking at my software, which is correct.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, you need at least 35 gallons for this flight. And turns out you had the wrong performance profile selected.
Yeah. This is something that I wonder sometimes even as an instructor, I use the for flight profiles, and sometimes I've noticed that the profiles that are in for flight are more accurate than what I get out of the POH. And how do you tackle that if you see that?
I'm kind of looking at a percentage difference. So if it's within about 2% of what the book says
Yeah.
and what I have and what the applicant has, that's pretty close. I know there is going to be some variation there,
Yeah.
but it really shouldn't be over a 2% variation there. If we can't narrow it down lower than that, then
Yeah.
we need to figure out why.
My personal opinion is to always like use the lowest, the most conservative thing, because if fuel burn says it's 10 gallons an hour, but then it's like 10.1 or something. If you err it on 10.5, then you're
Yeah.
always safe. So,
And that shows me, like, that line of thinking, if you were telling me that as an applicant, that shows me that you're exercising risk management. That's
yeah.
actually good. But if you fail to do that and just take, hey, that number that ForeFlight spit out, that's my minimum fuel. You're not putting enough thought process into that,
Yeah.
and you're not familiar enough with that EFB.
Okay. Well, the fourth easy step on how to fail your check ride is to don't know the failure modes of your system. What are we talking about?
I love to talk about failure modes. So, when you're training for your private pilot, you probably spend a lot of time training, learning about systems.
Yeah.
So let's take your electrical system. Most of the applicants, if I ask them, "Hey, how's your electrical system work?" They can give me a working knowledge of how that electrical system operates. Usually something about a battery and an alternator or generator, and maybe a light associated with a bad alternator. And that's fine. That's good. Okay, surface level systems knowledge. Then I'm going to ask, okay, well, how could that system fail? And so the two potential failure modes for most GA aircraft are an overvoltage condition or under voltage condition.
Yeah.
One that I love to give is, let's say your alternator belt broke. How would you know if it's a belt driven
Yeah.
alternator like most Cessnas are? How would you know that your alternator belt broke on a Cessna? I would ask the applicant that,
Yeah.
and I would expect to hear from them an understanding of what that failure mode
Yeah.
would look like.
Your
So,
battery's not going to be getting a charge.
yes, and how do we know our battery's not getting a charge? Well, we've got an amp meter that would show a discharge, and then most Cessnas will have a light of
Yeah.
some sort that will come on. Not all Cessnas have that light, but I would expect you to know that.
Yeah.
And so now you've alerted yourself to the fact that, oh, I'm in an under voltage condition. So
Yeah.
the next step is to try to recover the alternator, because remember, we're in the cockpit. We don't know that the belt's broken at this
Yeah.
point. So a lot of times the checklist is going to drive you to reset that alternator. So then you've reset the alternator, still doesn't work. So now we're just on battery power. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that means normally we got about 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Now, do we actually have 30 minutes?
Well, if the battery's new, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe just 20 minutes, and maybe it took us 5 minutes to identify the condition to begin with. So maybe we only have 15 minutes of battery power left.
Yeah.
So what do you do? What's your next step?
Well, I'd land as soon as possible. It just depends on your situation, but
Okay, so great. The applicants say, "Well, I'm gonna land as soon as possible." I'm like, "Okay, great. The next airport is 20 minutes away."
yep, this is where you have to use a little bit of common sense, I think.
Yeah, so exactly. I expect the applicant to have thought about this potential failure mode, which isn't crazy, right?
Yeah,
I'm not saying, okay, you're flying along and one of Elon Musk's satellites crashes in and takes off your right wing. Like, that's not a very realistic
yeah,
failure mode of anything. But losing an alternator is absolutely a potential failure mode. And being 20
yeah,
minutes away from an airport is absolutely reasonable. And if you only have 15 minutes of battery left and you don't do anything, what's going to happen is you're going to run out of battery for the last
yep.
5 minutes of your flight and be Nordo. Is that the safe thing to do?
No,
Probably not. So if you're in less congested airspace, which generally approaching an airport, you're going from less congested to more
yeah,
congested. What I would suggest doing is turning off all of your electrical, including your battery, and preserving that 15 minutes of battery
yeah,
power until you're about 10 minutes away from the airport, turning it back on. Now I've got battery when I need it, when I need to land. I can operate the flaps, I can operate the radio, I can operate my landing lights. If
yeah.
it's at night, that's really important, right? I need to be able to turn those lights on.
Yeah, because
I
I've come into a field before at night and I couldn't get the lights to turn on. It ended up being my fault, but
yeah.
I didn't have the right frequency. But the same thing could happen, and if you don't have landing lights and the ability to turn those lights on, it's almost impossible to land on a field without both landing lights and runway lights.
Agreed.
It is difficult.
And so we've just sat here and we've kind of discussed this failure mode
Yeah,
for just one of the systems. So you need to take each of the systems and be able to think about failure modes like we just
yeah,
discussed about the electrical system. And failure to do that means that you're probably not thinking in depth enough about the system, how it could fail, and how you would deal with that potential failure.
and I kinda put my ear up to the door when you're doing some of your oral exams, and I've noticed that a lot of your questions that you ask for the oral part are scenario based where, you could ask them like, "What are the required items?" But you don't really do that. What's kind of an example of a way you'd ask a question like that?
Well, kind of like we just talked about, giving a scenario where I'm giving you a condition where you're flying somewhere and you lose a system. One for, required documents. Instead of asking, hey, what are the required documents that you carry with you? I could easily ask that
Yeah,
question and you could answer it. But instead, I give my scenario beforehand, before you show up to the test, that you're taking a flight somewhere with some family. And I tell you, okay, during the course of doing this, you go out to the airplane and you see somebody with the FAA lanyard come up and they identify themselves as the ASI, tell you their name and hope you're having a good day. And they're here doing ramp inspections and they'd like to do a ramp inspection of your aircraft. What documents do you think they're going to ask for?
yeah,
So that's kind of a scenario-based way that I could ask that
yeah.
type of question.
And documents aren't the only thing. We were flying down from Alaska, or I was flying down with my brother-in-law, and we landed in Whitehorse, way up in the Yukon, and we lost our vacuum pump. And so basically, I had to fly all the way down from Whitehorse, Alaska, without a heading indicator and an attitude indicator. And just because I knew that those weren't required for VFR flight, but then we were limited to VFR only. So
Yeah,
we flew all the way from there VFR only. So that was quite the adventure.
yeah. And that might be, I'll chalk that away in the memory bank of like, yeah, here's the scenario. You're coming in from Whitehorse, your
Yeah.
vacuum pump fails. There's a horde of zombies chasing you. You gotta leave. Can you do that?
Yeah. Today's video is proudly sponsored by me. You heard that right. I took all the other ads out of this video so I could tell you about a product that I have that's going to revolutionize the aviation training market. Now, you probably already know this, but aviation ground courses are ridiculously expensive. We're talking like $300, and because of that, I developed this channel so that anyone can afford ground training. Now, keep in mind, the training is absolutely free, but if you need an endorsement for the written exam, the FAA requires instructors to make sure that students they endorse are ready for that test. And I'm able to do that now for people studying for their private pilot license through my premium ground course. Not only is this course super cheap, we're talking like 50 bucks, but it includes all the training videos you see here, 700 questions worth of quizzes and practice tests, reading assignments, and best of all, the endorsement which you have to be able to take the official FAA written exam. But you won't sacrifice quality. You can just read the comments here on YouTube to see how much people really love this course. If that sounds cool, check it out at freepilottraining.net. And by the way, every purchase makes it possible for me to make totally free content like the video you're watching right now. All right, the last step in how to fail your check ride is to not get enough sleep before the check ride. Is this a real thing?
Absolutely. And it's kind of ironic because one of the last sections of area of operation one in the private pilot and the commercial pilot is called human factors. So that's a task within area of operation one. And within human factors, you can imagine we're talking about hypoxia, we're talking about spatial disorientation. But a big one on there is fatigue. And I find a lot of applicants that come to the check ride are actually experiencing a fair amount of fatigue because they were up all night the night before, stressing out over this check ride, and now they're not performing their best.
Yeah,
And I would say the majority of the time I issue a disapproval, in the course of giving the debrief after the disapproval, I find that the applicant, you know, basically self-identifies. Well, I normally don't make this mistake. I was just really stressed out, didn't get a lot of sleep last night, and that's a contributing factor
yeah,
to that failure. So I would be willing to guess that the majority of disapprovals that occur every day
yeah,
maybe have fatigue as a contributing factor, but
yeah.
people are stressed out and they're not getting enough rest before the check ride.
Yep. You're your own worst enemies in a lot of cases because, yeah, if I knew a guy and when we went to pilot training, he basically just stressed and stressed and stressed. And like he was a great pilot when we were just flying normal training missions, but then he'd get super stressed and he couldn't sleep the night before a check ride, and then he'd just do terrible. And I was like, dude, just calm down.
Yeah.
Just relax.
I know I'll share how I've leveraged technology recently in my airline flying, in my military flying, basically all the flying that I do. I've got a Samsung watch and I've got a Samsung ring that I sleep with, and I've started tracking, basically doing health tracking.
Yeah.
And every day, Samsung Health gives me an energy score, and then gives me an energy score and a sleep score. This is kind of a nerdy way, but I like objective things.
Yeah.
So what I've discovered about myself is that anything that's around an 80 or below on an energy score, I might think about calling in fatigue
Mm,
either on that flight or
gotcha.
postponing a flight to get more rest if I'm below an 80.
And
Now you get in that 70 range and it's like, okay, could safely do this flight
yeah,
as long as it's not real challenging. So is there a lot of weather? Is there malfunctioning systems? Am I doing instruction? There's some ways that I can mitigate it, but I've got a personal hard line. If I'm anything below a 70 on my energy score,
yeah,
sleep score, I'm canceling that flight. I'm not flying the next day.
gotcha.
So you can use technology like that
Yeah.
to kind of track how you're sleeping before the check ride,
I think
but
so. I
but
think
try not to make big changes. Avoid alcohol. Get exercise every day. Try to get 8 hours of sleep. Drink lots of water, and get on that habit pattern for about a week at least
yeah,
prior to your check ride,
yeah.
and that will do wonders for your energy the day of the check ride.
Do you think exercise has a lot to do with, like, getting enough rest? Like, if
I think so. I know personally I can tell a big difference on days that I don't exercise and how I sleep versus
yeah,
days that I do, and I try to exercise every day, and it really helps so I don't
yeah.
have any problems, getting enough sleep at night.
Yeah, it's funny that you should mention that because I have a Garmin and it has something similar where it's like a body battery.
Yeah,
So I can tell, like, if I'm not nearly as rested. Like, the trip down here, I basically got no sleep, and so I was real tired.
yeah,
So, probably wouldn't have been good to fly then, but, after I got one night of, like, a 7.5 hour of sleep or something, then my body battery was way back up.
yeah.
I felt
So
fine.
Android users that have Samsung, and then I think most of the Apple Watches have a similar capability.
Yeah,
I would really suggest using that. And don't be afraid to cancel a check ride
yeah,
because you're fatigued. Me, any DPE, cannot issue a failure because you are fatigued. But if you decide to start a check ride and you're fatigued and you fail the check ride because you're fatigued, you're going to get a failure and that's going to follow your whole
yeah,
career, right? And everybody's worried about the constricting of the market right now. You don't want a failure on your record. a discontinuance or a no start,
Yeah.
right? Not even starting the check ride's not even a discontinuance, that's just not starting. That doesn't go on your record,
Yeah.
but a failure does. So seriously consider, postponing if you're fatigued.
A discontinuance would be like, I just took the oral exam and I'm super nervous, and then I told you like, I think I'm too stressed. Let's postpone this.
Yeah, yeah, you could do that. That doesn't happen often, but it does happen. If you are just a ball of nerves and you can't deal with the flight, let the examiner know, hey, I just don't feel like I can safely go out there and fly the airplane and do my best. I'd like to discontinue.
Is that gonna cost me a lot of extra money by doing something like that?
It depends on the examiner. The FAA doesn't have any policy on compensation for
Yeah.
discontinuances or continuations. Personally, they don't happen very often. I don't charge for them. So I
Okay.
kind of work them into the rest of my fee schedule. The main thing I want to avoid, and this is just ethically, personally, or like my personal
Yeah.
ethics here, is I don't want to put a monetary penalty on you making a safe decision.
That's
So
smart. Yeah.
if the weather isn't good, I don't want you to think about, man, normally I wouldn't fly in this weather, but Seth's going to charge me a bunch of money if I don't
Yep.
today. So I better go do that.
Yep.
You could make an argument that if you're going into professional aviation, that's the exact type of pressure to
Yep.
perform. You're going to be
It
faced with every day.
is.
But I choose just not to do that during
Yeah.
the testing environment. The test is stress enough itself. I don't want a monetary worry to be on there pressuring you to
Yeah.
go fly when you don't feel like it. So I personally don't charge for them. Other DPs do, and they might charge 50%. They might charge a whole other exam fee. So that's something that's required that your examiner brief before you sign the application. So if your examiner hasn't told you their fee scheduling
Yeah.
for discontinuances and disapprovals, before you sign the application, just politely ask, hey, what's your fee policy for discontinuances and disapprovals?
So let me ask you this, and this because I think this is in now that we've kind of got on this topic. If you do a disapproval, what's your fee for redoing the check ride? Because one of the viewpoints I've always had for when I take the check ride is worst that can happen is I fail and then I just take the check ride again. I mean, I think that's a good mindset to at least calm yourself down.
Yeah, I do up to half of the initial fee is the max that I'll charge for a retest. Again, other examiners have different fee schedules. There is no policy on this. But yeah, I do up to half, and usually it's less than that
Yeah.
because a disapproval, and I've talked about this in some podcasts, but let's say you go up and you botch up your short field landing, but you do everything else
Yeah.
great. Well, you get to keep credit for everything you did, and as long as we retest within that 60-day time frame, all we have to do is go up and do a short field
Yeah.
takeoff and landing. So in that case, I probably won't even do half. I'll probably do 100 or $200,
Yeah.
and we'll go up and do the retest, and you're good to go. Sometimes we can even do it the same day.
Yeah. And I think just by talking about this takes away some stress from some folks because I think, when I was getting my private pilot's license, I was like, I could fail and then it's going to be another $400 or whatever it is. But 100, $200 is not really that big a deal. So I don't mind the mindset of like, I'll just do my best. And if I fail, I fail.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, my dad always joked, he's in the Army, and whenever I was about to do something stressful like pilot training or survival school with the Air Force or whatever, he would always say, "Hey, son, just remember they can't kill you and they can't eat you." They could, though. I mean, it always could be worse. Yeah.
that's true. That's true. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show with me today. And that is 5 easy steps on how to fail a check ride. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to smash that like button and comment below what other content you'd like to see. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
See ya.